Thanks so much for having me. I just wanted to show you a little bit about our background here. So, How to Measure Anything was my first book, and the next book that comes out in just 2 weeks here is How to Measure Anything in Project Management. I'll talk about that one just briefly too, in addition to the risk management and cybersecurity related issues. But one thing I wanted to point out is that the methods I use aren't unique to cybersecurity. They're not even unique to risk management. They're part of decision analysis and game theory and statistical methods that have been around for really many decades. So these are just a few of the areas I've applied these methods to. So environmental policy, military logistics, large infrastructure projects, probably large IT projects, and specifically cybersecurity projects might be the plurality lately of all the projects we've applied these things to. So uh, I'd like to ask, what's your single biggest risk? That's something you should all think about, what your single biggest risk is. And I think you should all have the same answer. I think it's how you measure risk. That would affect all of the rest of your decisions about risk management. If you don't have a solution there that's working, or if you have a solution that's actually adding error, in other words, making your risk management worse, you wouldn't be able to allocate limited resources effectively. In fact, you might not be allocating them effectively and you wouldn't know about it because we have a very slow feedback cycle when it comes to risk management. So if you are doing something wrong today, you wouldn't necessarily find out tomorrow or the next week or even the next month. It might just be the one big catastrophic event, which becomes the data point that says you were doing it wrong. So, how are people doing this now? Well, we know a little bit about this. We've done several surveys in this space in enterprise risk management, project management, and in cybersecurity. And it appears that about half across all these different fields of the risk analysis methods are risk matrices. So, if that chart in the upper right-hand corner looks familiar to you, well, you're one of that population. I think that probably applies to many people that might be listening on this call, or you might know someone else in your organization that's using these things. It's about half. The remainder is actually still mostly other qualitative methods. In other words, they might use some sort of a weighted scoring method or high, medium, low sort of thing, but it's not probabilistic. And finally, the smallest group is, probabilistic statistics-based actuarial methods and so on. So, what should we be concerned about when we're analyzing methods? Well, one thing that we need to take into account is the existence of this phenomenon I ended up calling the analysis placebo. I showed just a few studies that support the existence of this. These are studies in completely different domains, but they all talk about how the adoption of a structured method, an apparently formal structured method, made people feel more confident in their decisions. And this was true whether it's analyzing the outcomes of sporting events or forecasting the performance of investment portfolios or forecasting how long projects will take, and even the guilt of criminal suspects. In each of these cases, confidence went up, but it went up even though performance was getting worse. This is what we have to look out for. We can believe that merely being a structured formal method is itself sufficient to claim that a method is working. That is not the case. Our confidence will improve even though the performance is getting worse. And this has been measured in a variety of contexts, not just the studies I mentioned here. Here's another very quick thing that you can do to assess your risk assessment approach, though. Does it answer the right question? If I looked at a risk matrix, will it answer something like, should I spend 1 million to move a dot in the red a little to the left or 3 dots in yellow down? Where do I allocate my limited resources? What I need is a kind of return on control or return on mitigation so that I can prioritize what the high impact benefits would be from investments in, say, fixing patches, vulnerabilities, or or investing in some big cybersecurity software, FireEye, something to this effect, right? Or more training. All of these things have a reduction, presumably, in risk. And if I can monetize that risk reduction, well, then I can compute a return on control. This is what we're trying to do. Now, there's quite a lot I could talk about regarding the research on risk matrices, but I'll just summarize quickly and say that every study that's ever been done that objectively measured the performance of decisions and estimates where organizations were using risk matrices determined that they either add no value at all or they make things worse. One study said risk matrices can be worse than useless, meaning that it's not just a waste of time and effort. It actually added error to the decisions. It made them worse than if they didn't do it at all. And probably the largest empirical study I've seen that looked at risk matrices in the oil and gas industry for operations risk. Operational risk here, by the way, in oil and gas, if you look at these risk matrices, you might think, well, that's not cybersecurity. Some of it is actually in the oil and gas industry for operational risk. But these risk matrices and the methodologies they're using are indistinguishable from what you might have seen in cybersecurity. And their findings are still applicable. They concluded that risk matrices should not be used for decisions of any consequence. I've never seen an objective study that looked at the data from a large number of organizations, et cetera, that concluded that people using risk matrices were better off than not using it. We've even done this relatively recently with the new book coming out, How to Measure Anything in Project Management, because people use risk matrices in project management. And again, we do not see an improvement. If anything, it makes things worse. So this is the only risk matrix you'll ever need. Just feel free to use this one. You've got the risk of using risk assessment methods that don't work. So that's your highest priority vulnerability. That's the highest priority patch that you need to implement, is improving the risk assessment methods themselves. So what does work? Well, here's one of those patches. It turns out that studies of algorithms versus experts when it comes to estimating things keep finding that algorithms are better than experts. And this is true in a surprising variety of fields. So this guy, Paul Meehl, he had collected over 150 studies by the time he died, closer to 200 actually, by the time he died, where he compared relatively naive, simple statistical historical models to human experts in things like prognosis of liver disease, the outcomes of sporting events, forecasting how long projects will take, or which small businesses will repay loans, etc. He said out of all of those studies, he might have been able to find maybe 6 where the humans did just as well or slightly better. And out of over 150 studies, you might expect that many outliers just as a random fluke. But the consistent finding is that the algorithms were better than the humans. Now, this gentleman, Philip Tetlock, you might recognize him from a more popular book he wrote called Super Forecasting. But I'm quoting here one of his first big academic research efforts, Expert Political Judgment. He tracked 284 experts in a 20-year-long study. These were experts in military affairs, economics, technology trends, politics, etc. He gathered over 82,000 forecasts. If you're familiar with how clinical trials work in the pharmaceutical industry, this is on par with the biggest clinical trials. Much, in fact, bigger than many trials, bigger than most. And he concluded this: it is impossible to find any domain in which humans clearly outperformed crude extrapolation algorithms, less still sophisticated statistical ones. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that, yeah, this probably applies to cybersecurity experts as well. So here's something else that works. We know that people who build Monte Carlo simulations are apparently better at forecasting than people who don't. There's multiple studies on this, but if you're not familiar with the concept, I think a lot of you are, but if you want a very simple way of explaining it, it's how you do the math when you don't have exact numbers. So how do I do the math when all of the numbers in a big cash flow, for example, are uncertain? They're all probability distributions. Well, I sample them all many times over and over. Instead of computing one ROI or one NPV, what I get is a distribution. And I can answer questions like, what's the probability that I would lose money? 15%, 2%, 40%? What's the chance that this would pay off in the first year? Again, I can answer questions like that if I'm given a distribution as opposed to an exact point. If you compute an ROI or an NPV on some investment in cybersecurity or enterprise risk management, and you figure out that the NPV is $15.25 million, one thing I can tell you for sure is it's probably not that. There's going to be a distribution of possible outcomes, and we can compute that with a Monte Carlo. And it's not that hard. I actually give away Monte Carlo simulation spreadsheets on the websites for the books. You go to howtomeasureanything.com and you click on one of the books and you see all these Monte Carlo website spreadsheets. So here's a way that we can actually represent risk in a way that agrees with the quantitative methods that people use when they do the actual math in actuarial methods, nuclear power risk assessment methods, statistics, and so forth. This chart in the lower left here is a loss exceedance curve. This curve shows the probability of losing more than X on the horizontal axis in a given period of time. And so this horizontal axis is a log scale. And this particular curve, it's hypothetical, but let's say it's for some very large organization, shows that they have a 40% chance of losing in excess of $10 million in the next year, and about a 10% chance of losing more than 200 million in the next year. So if you just follow that curve along. Now, that's mathematically unambiguous. I don't know how to do the math with, high, medium, low, but I know how to do the math with this. If we can generate these, and by the way, the spreadsheets that I give away on the book's websites generate this. This is something you can do in Excel. This is a simple simulation. And we just use features in Excel that run Monte Carlo simulations to do this. So it's not that hard. We can answer questions like, what's the return on this particular mitigation? That's what we need to know. If we can, a very simple approach to optimizing a portfolio is just rank everything by their return on investment and just go down the list until you run out of money. Now, something else that this kind of method lets us do is we can quantify risk aversion. Now, there's some other ways to do this. I talk a lot about something called utility theory as well in the books, but I'm going to keep it simple for right now and just mention that loss exceedance curve. Decision makers are also highly inconsistent when it comes to stating their risk aversion or making decisions that involve risk aversion. Some of you might be in organizations where the executives were asked to put together a risk statement of some sort, a risk policy, a risk aversion or risk tolerance statement, perhaps. Those are usually not helpful at all when it comes to making specific risky decisions. They're not quantitative to begin with. They'll say, we accept a moderate amount of risk for losing more than 10 million in cybersecurity, or they leave out the 10 million. We accept a moderate risk for cybersecurity attacks, or a low risk. That doesn't tell me where to put money. And they're quantitatively meaningless as well. Here's some studies that have been done that show how pliable our risk aversion is on a day-to-day basis. Experiments can be done where if you show people photos of smiling people prior to playing a game of chance, that they are more risk tolerant playing that game of chance afterward. You can track them. This has been done. If you also ask people to describe an event in their lives when they were very afraid, and another group are asked to describe an event when they were angry, you will observe that the people who describe the fear event will subsequently play a game of chance, being more risk averse than people who describe the anger event. We would like to think that our decisions in a business are not influenced by random, irrelevant external factors like this, but they are. We can avoid this. This is an entirely avoidable problem. we can quantify risk tolerance in a meaningful, mathematically substantive way and put a stake in the ground so it doesn't change arbitrarily every day and you're making different investments one day than you would have another day simply because you're more risk averse on Thursday morning than you were Tuesday afternoon. So one way we can do this, and again, this is the simple way, not the utility theory method we often use, but we can right on that loss exceedance curve chart, just draw another curve, and we'll call that our risk appetite loss exceedance. So what we want to do is try to get an inherent risk. That's our current risk without the discretionary controls we're about to consider. So we have some controls. It's not really realistic to consider a complete lack of controls. You don't publicly announce everybody's passwords or something like this. There's still going to be basic controls. We're talking about discretionary controls that you could add or not, and it wouldn't necessarily be negligent if you didn't add them. So these are discretionary. What we're hoping is that by adding those controls, you can reduce your loss exceedance curve and get the residual risk curve entirely underneath the risk appetite curve. And again, the free spreadsheets we give away on the website do this. So here's what you would see on the website. You take a risk matrix like what you might be used to seeing, and every dot on that risk matrix becomes a row in a spreadsheet that you can download. And for each row in that spreadsheet, you can still use subjective estimates, by the way. Subjective is not the bad thing. Some subjective methods clearly outperform other subjective methods. And as I'll show you, that people can be trained to subjectively assess probabilities better. So that's not a problem by itself. You can subjectively assess the likelihood of a cyber event or some other event in the next 12 months and subjectively assess a 90% confidence interval for what the impact would be. Now, sometimes people would say, yeah, but I don't have the data for that. Well, you didn't have the data when you filled out the risk matrix either. But if you do have any data, or if you can do any math at all, you can do the math with the table on the right. You can't do that with the risk matrix. And what you're seeing here is just a little animation showing that there's a simulation going on, and we're actually generating that loss exceedance curve we talked about. So that simulation will generate, these are the spreadsheets you can download straight off that website there. So by the way, I don't even track your names. You don't even have to sign up for the newsletter for this. I would feel guilty charging for it because it's so trivial. Why don't more people do this? So use that spreadsheet to generate a simulated inherent loss curve, a simulated residual loss curve, and on the same spreadsheet, you can define a risk tolerance. So why don't people use more of these methods, you might think? It's trivial. You can do it in Excel. People do it in Python and R and other things, but you don't even need that. You can just do it in Excel. Excel's pretty functional these days for these sorts of things. So if the reasons that people aren't doing it are some misconceptions, then we should probably correct those. So let me ask, have you heard or said any of these things? Maybe by show of hands, you can say, have you heard someone say we don't have sufficient data? I don't know if you can raise hands here on this interface, but feel free to do
Doug,
that. Yeah.
Can you see us? Because we can't see you, but
Oh yeah. Okay. I was camera off, but I can certainly turn it on actually.
yeah, that'd be nice. I mean, where are you, Doug? Just as a matter of interest.
Oh yeah. So I'm usually in the Chicago area, but I'm in Houston today and tomorrow because I'm speaking. I'm speaking at another event.
Yeah. Because you have a sort of a North American accent. I don't know whether it's slightly Canadian, but
yeah, Midwestern, I guess. Yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is just where you are. So,
yeah, you bet. So let me just, I'll wonder if some of you heard the question or the statement, we don't have sufficient data. That's actually a very specific mathematical claim. And it's a mathematical claim for which I have never seen anyone produce the proof of when they say it. Think of it this way. Ask them this. Did they actually compute the uncertainty reduction from a given amount of did they actually compute the uncertainty reduction from a given amount of data? Sorry, it looks like my battery. There we go. Sorry, my laptop was about to run out of power and I had to plug it in very quickly. That statement is a claim that they actually computed the uncertainty reduction they could get from a given amount of data. Don't know.
He did give us warning. So. Two
Laptop's died.
yeah, just charge it so it would.
Yeah, no, it's got offline completely. Yeah, because laptop's died. It's gone completely offline. What is that? Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. So yeah.
So where's the pizza?
Just
Sorry? Well, they usually.
it's usually pizza. It's usually early as well.
Yeah, I mean,
Can you hear us?
yeah. Doug, are you there? I don't think so. Doug?
Yeah, it's not about half an hour ago. Guy's computer went out of power, so
Hello?
he dropped off suddenly.
Oh, okay. It's not.
Sorry, my computer apparently was having more problems than I knew. It was apparently thought it needed to restart. So you all hear me now, though, fine?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, my apologies. I don't know how soon I'll get back to slides, but let me just continue on that. So, yeah, these are some common misconceptions about statistical and quantitative methods in general. I find myself routinely addressing, actually. So think of that claim that we don't have sufficient data as a very specific quantitative statement. Or maybe you've heard that perhaps, maybe you've heard that perhaps.
Your screen, you're not sharing the slides.
I know.
Okay,
I said my
right.
computer is restarting. Maybe
Okay.
you can share them. I don't know why it's restarting, by the way. But perhaps, you have them, and so maybe we can switch and you can share them.
It's good to see you, Doug. It's good to
Yeah.
see your face.
So anyway, that part of our risk management in this case was for me to send you slides in advance, so you have those at least. And you can share them, or I can continue talking because I've given this many times, actually. Another issue that people run into is they believe that the appearance of complexity or intelligent adversaries or rapidly changing technology all somehow have some bearing on the applicability of quantitative methods. Remember, the risk matrix doesn't alleviate any of those issues. You still had a lack of data, intelligent adversaries and all of these other problems. When you filled out a risk matrix, you just felt better about it. That's that analysis placebo I was talking about. So let me just point out that there's really only three reasons that anybody ever thought that something was immeasurable. And they're all three illusions. And I talk about this in the first book, actually. We call them concept, object, and method. Concept is what measurement means. The object of measurement is the thing you're trying to measure. And methods of measurement refers to statistical inference. How does that actually work? So the concept of measurement comes down to it not meaning what a lot of people think it means. It doesn't mean an exact point, actually. Measurement has not meant an exact point for about 100 years in the empirical sciences. And it doesn't mean that for practical decision-making either. The way we define it is a quantitatively expressed reduction in uncertainty based on observation. That's the most relevant use of the term, actually, both in the empirical sciences and for optimizing decisions. So you have a prior state of uncertainty, maybe a very wide range of possible values for something represented as a probability distribution. You make some observations, do some trivial math, and then you have less uncertainty than you had before. You have a narrower range, et cetera. You have higher density around fewer values. That's what measurement really means in the most practical sense. So if we misunderstood measurement to mean an exact point, well, then lots of things aren't measurable. Even things in fundamental physics might not be measurable if we mean an exact point, because that's just a matter of degree, their exactness. But if we think about measurement as a reduction in uncertainty, then a lot more things become practical to measure. Secondly, the object of measurement. The object of measurement refers to the thing that you're trying to measure. Now, if you're trying to measure something like innovation and collaboration or reputation, we just have to ask what you mean by those things. What do you see when you see more of it? So let's think about this for a moment. How many of you, by show of hands, have to think about measuring reputation? And how would you measure that? My question would be is, what do you see when you see damage to reputation, for example? How would you measure damage to reputation? What do you see if you saw a bigger damage to reputation? Any thoughts on that? Just think in terms of what you see when you see more of it. What would you expect to observe if one organization had much more damage to its reputation than another organization?
Well, a change in the dollar value of something, the profitability or stock price. You choose your metric. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
It all ends up in
relevant.
dollars. It all ends up in dollars.
Right. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. All of those are observable consequences of something. And by the way, if you can't observe it, it's probably not actually relevant to a practical decision. It has to be detectable in some way in order to be relevant to practical decision making. But the handy thing about reputation damage, this isn't true for a lot of things that are initially considered intangible, but something that's very handy for reputation damage is the fact that all reputation damage, by definition, is public knowledge. There's no such thing as secret damage to reputation. You have access to all of the cases of reputation damage. We've actually done this analysis. So if I were able to show you, say, stock charts of different organizations that declared a data breach and did an analysis of the volatility and absolute price of their stock prices before and after the announcement of the data breach, what would we see? We actually conducted this analysis in the first edition of How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, and then we updated it in the second edition. The bottom line is, in most cases, for most organizations, you would not be able to detect the difference in stock prices. There's a few where it did. So SolarWinds and Equifax, the actual stock price dropped precipitously, well outside of historical volatility, and it persisted. In most other cases, even when they're banks and things like this, and insurance companies, what you would observe is some volatility, and it does go down half the time. It goes up half the time. And the amount of change is more or less consistent with historical volatility. So when Target was breached, for example, their news articles came out about, how much the stock prices dropped after the big Target breach announcement. Well, Target is the big retailer in the States. But the drop was consistent with historical observations, and the drop was not persistent. It just bounced back up again. So a lot of people started reporting too soon. They were confusing normal volatility with something to do with the data breach. So what's the real cost? We're not saying there's not a real cost to this. There are fines. There are other things that cost money. One of them we might call penance projects. So my co-author called them a penance project, for example. A penance project was where you invest a bunch of money and effort to alleviate what could be even worse. So you have a major data breach and ask yourself this, would you sit back and just wait for the worst to happen? Probably not. You would probably maybe you have a contingency plan in place. that if a data breach happened, here's the things that you'd have to go through. One of the things you should do, by the way, is spend a lot of money on good fraud detection services for the affected stakeholders, whether they're your employees or customers or whatever. That's what people do. And then you also have announcements about your doubling down on these big risks and so forth. The public appears to be pretty forgiving for most organizations if they respond well. Some organizations like SolarWinds and Equifax, they affected a lot of their other clients basically because of their own negligence, and they didn't handle it well. And that was a big problem. That was the reason it went down so fast. So many of your organizations will have vulnerability to the GDPR fines. And because of that, that is a whole other level of liability. But now there's a lot of data on it. We knew quite a lot about this. So it looks like my computer's still restarting. Fortunately, I remember all the slides. So the object of measurement is another item. So knowing what measurement means and then understanding what the object of measurement is, clarifying it in terms of what you see when you see more of it, okay? Finally, the methods of measurement. How does statistical inference actually work? Well, there's a lot of misconceptions about this actually, but we know how we can make statistical inference. And there's a few things that I would probably point out just to keep in mind. Number one, you have more data than you think. I hear this all the time for people in risk management, but they don't have sufficient data. I would say be more resourceful because you actually have a lot of data. We have a lot of data about the relative performance of different risk assessment methods. That's something we have a lot of data on. You have a lot of data in terms of your own historical data, but also how you can compare to other organizations. My life insurance company I haven't died yet. So what data does my life insurance have that it could use to compute my life insurance premium? Well, it casts a wide net and it interpolates among a more heterogeneous population. That's what it does. So you do have data along those lines. We also find out that you probably need less data than you think. This is a consequence of Bayesian analysis. But have you ever run into a situation where if you have a lot of uncertainty, somebody might think you need a lot of data to measure it? Does that sound familiar? I have all this uncertainty, so I'm going to take a lot of it.
It sounds intuitive, yeah.
Yeah. Mathematically speaking, just the opposite is true. The more uncertainty you have, the easier it is to reduce uncertainty with the first few observations. So it's actually easier to reduce uncertainty when you have a lot of it, not in spite of having a lot of it, but because you have a lot of it. Here's the way to think about the math. If you know almost nothing, almost anything will tell you something. That's what the math says. Okay, so if you to convert the math into a little pithy statement, that's what it's saying. Okay, so you get a big payoff relatively early on observations. You have more data than you think, you need less than you think, and another really good measurement maxim to assume is that it's probably been measured before. Don't forget that. Almost anything that you have to deal with has been measured before. I can't think of any risk that any of you would normally be dealing with that there aren't multiple studies on. So we've done this analysis. When I write books, I tend to cite a lot of empirical sources, and I can't find risk that don't have a lot of data. Even relatively new things like AI, we have some data on these items. Even some of the bigger risks from AI that people might think about, it's not like we have zero data about how to think about that. And we don't need a lot of data to think about it. In fact, we know how to put some constraints on what AI might be able to do even the next 2 years. We have some idea because of algorithmic constraints and hardware constraints and how many data centers are being built, et cetera. So it's not like we have no idea about those things. So I call those measurement maxims. You have more data than you think, you need less than you think, and it's probably been measured before. Okay, so just bear that in mind. I would also mention, by the way, that some new areas of risk we've done risk assessments for are related to my next book. How to Measure Anything in Project Management is a whole new area of risk. One of my co-authors, Alex Budzire, did an analysis. He's a professor at the Said School of Business at University of Oxford. He determined through multiple methods that he compared that somewhere between 10 and 30% of the entire world's GDP is spent on projects. We also know that less than 1% of all projects are finished on time, on budget, and meeting expectations. So that's a really bad track record. And we know from decades of data now, they've gathered many decades of data. They have a huge database of these projects. There's no improvement. It doesn't matter how many people get certified or what new methods are developed or what new software is developed for project management. It doesn't seem to get better. Now, there might be other explanations. Maybe someone could argue that the projects are more ambitious or something like this. And so they're simply, the complexity of project is simply rising to meet the capability of the tools and methods and so forth. But we don't see a lot of data backing that up either. What we do find is that there's so much uncertainty about benefits and costs, and this has been measured, that even if you thought initially that the benefits were about twice the cost, there's about a 14% chance that you'd lose money, given how much uncertainty you have on both the cost and the benefits. In fact, there's about a 9% chance that you'd lose more than what you're investing. The worst case is not just losing everything you put into the project. The worst case is that it interferes with other things outside of the project, or it makes the process that you're trying to improve worse than it was before. That happens too. In fact, those numbers are probably optimistic because our data leaves out the projects that are just canceled. There's a survivorship bias in Oxford Global Projects database, so they're going to be correcting that now. But if you include projects that get canceled, and cancellation rates are pretty high for large IT projects, when you take that into account, those percentages go up even further. So that's a pretty big problem by itself. Fortunately, we have a number of ways to actually alleviate this problem. We know how to address this. There's lots of very handy mathematical methods where we can define options in advance for basically interfering with or interjecting in many situations in a project as it comes up, right? So what you need to do is figure out when you need to change course and have that model develop in advance, and that model is being fed data on a daily basis and just running in the background. It's not something that has to be a big burden for the project manager. They're defined in advance and running in the background. It's an intervention decision option, basically. So that project management is a big one. That book comes out in 2 weeks, and the website will be up in 2 weeks. And by the way, the website will have a chat bot on it too. So it's been fed the whole book and everything, and it can answer questions about it. And it still has, like all the other books, all these spreadsheets where you can run these simulations, even some fairly elaborate ones. The last one I would mention is that how many of you use Gartner? Does anybody use Gartner in this group? Your organizations? If you use it, you might have been noticing that there's been a big stock price decline in Gartner the past several months. Has anybody noticed that? Keeping track of that? Well, it's dropped precipitously, and it caused me to go into and look at the specific methods they use. And in my books, I talk a lot about the methods that are very popular but don't work, and they have no decision science behind them, no statistical methods behind them. And unfortunately, that seems to apply to most everything that Gartner does. I did this analysis on magic quadrants, for example, and magic quadrants, it turns out, don't tell you much more than bigger is better, plus a bunch of random error and inconsistency if I just extrapolate from what the general research says about these methods. So it looks like the emperor never really did have clothes with Gartner. It's not just a recent problem with AI. Some of the people I know at Gartner, and including some people who've recently left Gartner after being there for about 10 years or so, have told me that within Gartner, they were concerned in February of this year when deep research came out on ChatGPT, because they thought that deep research was producing research about as good as their analysts could do. And so I thought, well, let's take a look at what their business model is. They have over 20,000 staff. Less than 10% of them are actual analysts. And less than a third of analysts are what you would call senior analysts. And most of this research is done by junior analysts, people with 5 years or less experience, much less experience than the people they advise. And they're using methods that I've debunked in other books in different applications. So it seems like it's probably time to radically rethink what an advisory service does and what its business model is. You could probably do it for a fraction of that price. So what I was going to ask the group to do, if you're interested, please reach out to me if you're interested in participating in a roundtable or focus group about what the real needs are for something like that. Because I'm interested in diving into it further, because I think there's a whole new area of possible solutions to something. So if you're familiar with Gartner, you probably spend too much on it. That's just a thought. You don't need that kind of overhead. There's about 3 times as many sales reps at Gartner than there are analysts, even including junior analysts. There's about 3 times as many sales reps and account managers and people like that. So that's the kind of overhead you're typically paying for, actually, with Gartner fees. That brings me to the end. Sorry for the slides, but I happen to have given this material a lot, so fortunately I could still proceed.
Right. Thank you very much, Doug. I don't know. I think we'll figure out a way how to share the slides. We couldn't load them from here because that would have meant disrupting the whole. That's what was advised.
Oh, okay.
Taking everything apart. So, but it's one more thing to think about when organizing events like this.
Yeah, no problem. By the way, it looks like my computer is up and running again. So,
Murphy's Law?
Yeah. So I might be able to hop on, but I'm certainly available for questions if anybody has anybody.
Yes. So we now move into the question and answer session. Are there any questions from anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, Doug, my name's Jeff Boyd. I'm sort of interested. You're sort of making the point that we need algorithms, algorithms that tend to be good things, but I think you also said that subjectivity is good, and I'm going to sort of observe that very often the data that you put into these things is subjective data, professional judgment rather than numeric data. If you come from an engineering background, let's say the manufacturing background, you might have actual empirical data of mean time to failure of things, but that's very rare in other professional settings. So this is, an ambiguity, isn't there, between we need more mathematical models, but in fact, we're just putting in the data is just human subjective guesswork, isn't it?
Yeah, but it turns out, as I mentioned, that some subjective methods measurably outperform others. And something we have a lot of empirical data on, and everybody has this empirical data, is all of the research that's gone into the performance of humans at estimating things. There's a ton of data on that. Now, engineers, and lots of our clients are engineers and working on engineering problems. Can you imagine a situation that would cause a lot of problem if you used an uncalibrated measurement instrument on some step in a process? Can you imagine that? Use an uncalibrated measurement instrument. Can you see that causing problems?
Yeah, that would be a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you ask engineers for subjective estimates and they're not calibrated, you're doing that every time. Every time anybody ever put together a project plan and the subject matter experts were not actually trained to put probabilities on things, even subjectively. It's a skill you can learn, by the way. So, for example, you can get pretty good at estimating the distance to things. That's a skill you can learn if you have a little bit of practice, right? When I was in the Army National Guard many decades ago, I was field artillery, and we could estimate distances to things with some practice. Now that's subjective, but how good we are is measurable. How well a forward observer estimates distance can be confirmed and evaluated. Likewise, we can estimate, we can measure and observe how well subject matter experts put probabilities on things. how, if you have a bunch of estimates of project task durations, and then you compare subsequently known actuals to the original estimates, you're gathering data about their performance. That's part of calibration, is to understand what the error of the instrument really is. Not just to reduce the error, that's nice when you can do that, but at least understanding what the error is. That's part of an instrument's calibration, right? So it turns out, by the way, on those Monte Carlo simulations I was talking about, that
Recording in progress.
hello. All right, I think I'm better now. So I'm back on my regular computer.
Okay.
All right. So, but I've actually gone through all the content. I think some of the slides might actually help explain some of these items. Yeah, that research I was telling you about, the performance of Monte Carlo simulations, people who build Monte Carlo simulations are better than people who don't, even when the inputs are subjective. They perform even better when the people providing the subjective inputs have been calibrated, and we know what their errors are when they estimate things. We can include their historical estimation error in our models. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We do that routinely, by the way. So even subjective estimation methods, those have performance that we can measure, and it has been measured many times. There's a large body of research about exactly this. All right. Now, it looks like I'm back to my screens here now. So, but I did actually get through the content. So yeah, remember that Monte Carlo simulations, they work regardless. It's not about being perfect, it's about being better. So like Voltaire said, perfect is the enemy of the good. And it's definitely the case for decision models. The fact that we use some subjective does not mean that it invalidates a quantitative algorithm that we're talking about. The problem is that the previous methods that we're replacing can add error. This has been studied too. So even decomposing the sources of an estimate make estimates better. When an engineer estimates the cost of something or the effort of something, don't they actually break it down into pieces? Well, it turns out, this has been studied, that actually improves estimates. In a way, what Monte Carlo simulations help you do is they help you decompose the sources of your uncertainty. So yes, that's a great question. That's a very good one. Yeah, it's not that all subjective is bad. Subjective and quantitative are not mutually exclusive at all. Quantitative and qualitative, many of the qualitative methods and mathematical methods, those are mutually exclusive. Subjective and quantitative are not mutually exclusive. A human's just another measurement instrument with measurable calibrated performance and so forth.
Right. Look, I don't know whether I can see some of the questions on there.
Could I ask a question?
All right. Okay. There's another question coming in here, from here.
Sure.
Hi, Doug. I have a question about aggregating all of your risk assessed systems so the step after what you've been talking to us about. So when you are actually in a data rich environment and you've assessed hundreds of different systems, IT systems in your line of business, and now you want to aggregate all that to get kind of a sector level view, what approach would you recommend to tackle that to a mathematically naive audience?
I would just use the methods I just mentioned, actually. This is pretty straightforward. In this spreadsheet right here, you can download for free. But you can compute a loss exceedance curve for the entire IT portfolio if you're interested in risk. You can compute a portfolio level distribution of returns. You can really only do that, though, if we're using the quantitative methods. I have no idea how to do this in my head. I wouldn't be able to do this in my head, and I certainly wouldn't be able to do it with some qualitative method.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a great point, because we're often asked to do portfolio level analysis to aggregate hundreds of projects in many industries. So we do that routinely, actually. So this is, I wanted to mention some of the research that's been done on calibration. And so a lot of it started with this guy, Daniel Kahneman. And we actually have, we've actually calibrated over 3,000 people to date at Hubbard Decision Research. It's just a matter of training. We take them through it, and we can measurably track and verify their performance at it, just like any measurement instrument. I think there was a question. Go ahead.
At what sort of tasks? What were, just for example, something? What sort of exact tasks were you measuring them at? What sort of tasks were they doing? You mentioned one is estimating the length of duration of.
Oh, it's not just, it could be tasked to any kind of a project, but it's not just task. It could be the impact of a new productivity improvement from IT. It could be measuring how much downtime you'd have after a major data breach. It could be measuring the impact of new environmental policies. It could be how much a kilometer of road service will cost. It could be the probability of various inclement weather events affecting your big project. It could be the probability that you'll suffer a ransomware attack. Those are all the sorts of things that, military logistics, public health and human services, et cetera. All of that stuff is all the sorts of things that we've trained people for that actually get involved in subsequently estimating probabilities of.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's interesting.
Doug, there's a question online. I know we're pressed for time now. And it's from Andrew. I'm sure you can see it on the screen, but it says risk matrices may not be a good way of analyzing absolute risk, but when ranking risks in order of priority to focus on, for example, in an audit, is this not still a useful method to use?
No, it never is. Any value is an illusion. The way to rank them is this expected return over here. This return on control, that's how you rank them. That's actually, even when the inputs are subjective, the qualitative methods where you have a 5-point scale, there's been a bunch of research on how those add error. Now, I didn't spend enough time on this particular limited conversation to describe all the work that's been done in this, but the risk matrices are making your risk assessments worse. They're not helping. You can abandon them immediately in favor of a simple simulation like this, and you'll never look back. It doesn't alleviate any of the problems that you're talking about.
So what you're saying, Doug, is that use your input data, but apply some probabilistic methods to it, and then plot them out.
Yeah, again,
rather than subjectively go to the end judgment on what the risk is.
Yeah, well, remember, subjective itself is not the problem. It's the particular methods, like the qualitative methods that do the pseudo math, is the problem. You can calibrate people on their subjective performance, but we also know that people who decompose the sources of their uncertainty, like using Monte Carlo simulations, things like this, that's what accountants do in general too, is they decompose revenue and expenses. And of course, you end up with better answers when you do that. Now, the other good thing with quantitative methods, of course, is that you don't have to rely on subjective estimates. You can do the real math with those. That's the other main benefit of this, is when you do have data, we can use statistical methods to update those estimates that might have started with subjective estimates from calibrated subject matter experts.
Right. Doug, in the last few minutes, are there any questions? I can't see any online. Are there any other questions here? Okay. One more question.
Go ahead.
What is observable is controllable. But as far as risk is concerned, we know risk from the data, which would give us the 5 colors of risk. That is very low, low, medium, high, very high. These are subjective estimates that the input data will tell us, but it won't give us something exactly. This is just a subjective analysis based on what we have as the input data.
Yeah. Remember, the problem with that is not that it's subjective, it's that it's qualitative. Those are two different things. So yes, you are making subjective judgments, but you can skip the language of high, medium, low, high, very probable, high impact, critical, etc. Just skip that entirely and talk about probabilities of events and probability distributions of impacts. That's what you should switch to. Even if those are subjective, it's an improvement over the qualitative pseudomath. So qualitative and subjective, two different things. I'd want to emphasize that. Subjective, coming from a calibrated subject matter expert, is like any other measurement instrument. It is data. Because just like any other measurement instrument, we've calibrated that. We know something about the error of that measurement instrument, and we can include that uncertainty in our model. We do routinely. But of course, once you've gotten other outside data, you can update your model with that. I don't know how to move the dots around on a risk matrix with outside data. But I know how to do it with the models I just showed you. That's straightforward. Does that make sense? Qualitative, subjective, two different things. Subjective can be quantitative. You can use subjective inputs into quantitative models, especially if they're coming from calibrated experts, by the way. Qualitative and pseudomath is a whole other category.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug. It's been quite an insightful presentation, and I know it took us quite a while getting here today, only for, certain small mishaps, but I'm sure we'll walk around that and get the information out in the way that we would want to. Really grateful because I know it's this thoughts a few weeks ago, you were giving up quite a chunk of your time and revenue to volunteer to give us this talk. Hopefully, just to let the audience know, Doug will be in the UK. I can't remember the dates, Doug, but he's in the UK at some point from the end of this month to the beginning of November, launching the book he just saw. And he informs me that he'll be sending out invitations on LinkedIn for meetups in various parts of the UK. So it will be a good opportunity if anyone could take it up to continue this discussion. Doug, you still there?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm happy to stick around. I don't know what happened with my computer, why it thought it automatically had to restart, but I was able to hop on my phone, and when it came back, this is able to do this. So I'm happy to stick around for a bit if people still have questions. We've got a lot more research about these things, but I would say that the main things that I would want to convey, by the way, is you can just stop using high, medium, low, red, yellow, green, very likely, very unlikely, all the verbal labels, and start using proven components. If you would like to join us for some kind of a roundtable focus group about the validity and what we can do differently with advisory services, just email me. Just email us and let us know you'd like to be on one of these focus groups, and we'd love to talk to you and continue this research.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug.